In this video, we are going to begin examining corruption issues in the water and sanitation sector. We'll start by looking at the question of where corruption is happening. This slide is not about corruption. It shows where innovation is happening around the world's cities. The blue spikes are IT employment. The orange spikes show the number of patents. And the black spikes show the amount of venture capital. Now look at the Transparency International map of the extent of corruption. The dark red color indicates where corruption is worse. Now look again at the global map of sanitation coverage that you've already seen. Comparing these three maps, you can see that innovation is occurring in cities where corruption and water and sanitation are not problems. Conversely, there is a strong overlap between countries with high corruption and low coverage. This means that if you want to work on problems of water and sanitation in developing countries, you're going to be working in places where corruption is a big problem. This table shows Transparency International's top 20 countries, in other words, the countries with the least corruption. Denmark, New Zealand, Sweden, Singapore, all nice places to work, but they don't have many poor households with water and sanitation problems. This table shows Transparency International's bottom 23 countries, in other words, the countries with the worst corruption. Sudan, Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Somalia. These are the countries with some of the worst corruption, and all these countries have challenging water and sanitation problems. These are the kind of places that need your water and sanitation policy skills. Here's a 2x2 table that presents a simple topology of the skill and knowledge level of donors and government officials. For several years, I've asked my students in my water policy course which of the four cases best describe status quo conditions in low-income countries with serious water and sanitation problems. Which case would you pick? Some students push back and say that there are people with different knowledge and skill levels in both donor and government organizations, and of course they're right. But I tell them to think about which case, on balance, do they think is most typical. This next 2x2 table presents a slightly different topology of the motivation of donors and government officials. This topology separates both groups into self-interested, corrupt versus well-meaning, altruistic. Of course, self-interested is not quite the same as being corrupt. But I again ask students to think about which case, on balance, is most typical in their experience. I have found that I receive all kinds of answers to both questions. Students' answers typically fall into all four cells in about equal proportions, and students are surprised by other students' answers. In my career, I've met many altruistic donors and government officials who are trying their best to do the right thing. But on balance, I'd say it's a good working assumption to assume that most people are by necessity looking out for their careers. They are to a large extent self-interested, and the problems are always so challenging that knowledge and skill levels are in short supply. Whether specific individuals are in fact corrupt is sometimes not easy to determine, but in some cases it will be apparent. One point I want to make about these two tables is that corruption typically takes two parties. For example, if a bribe is paid, someone has to pay the bribe and someone has to receive it. So if corruption is high, donors and contractors from industrialized countries are often a party to such transactions. This next table shows Transparency International's Bribe Payers Index. Officials and contractors in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, and Germany are perceived to be the least willing or least likely to pay a bribe. On the other hand, at the bottom of the table, officials and contractors in Russia, China, Mexico, and Indonesia are perceived to be the most likely to pay bribes. In this next set of slides, I want to show you how money flows in a donor-funded project and where opportunities for corruption lie. Of course, there's no one protocol that all donors use, but the one I will describe is fairly typical. Suppose the international donor wanted to get involved in the water and sanitation sector and support the construction of a new rural water supply program in a developing country. This figure shows 5 main stakeholders: the donor, the Ministry of Water Resources or national government, the Ministry of Finance may get involved, the villages, foreign consultants, and local consultants. The first step is for representatives of the donor to make a pre-planning mission to the country and discuss sector issues with the various ministries. The team might make a quick trip to the villages to see local water and sanitation conditions. In the second step, after considerable discussions and agreement to undertake a project, the Ministry of Water Resources issues a request for proposals to undertake a large planning study or perhaps a construction effort. The foreign consultants get the RFP. Step 3. The foreign consultants team up with a team of local consultants to prepare a joint bid. They submit proposals to the Ministry of Water Resources. In Step 4, the ministry and the international donor evaluate the bids and select their preferred consulting team. At this step, local consultants might attempt to influence the selection process at the Ministry of Water Resources. In Step 5, officials in the ministry and the top-ranked consulting firm attempt to negotiate a contract. Here, officials in the ministry may attempt to solicit a bribe from the contractor or the consultant in order to successfully conclude the negotiations. In Step 6, the local consultants, in collaboration with the foreign consultants, conduct the study or they build the project. In Step 7, the consultants submit an invoice or a series of invoices to the ministry for approval. The consultants may pay a bribe to the ministry to accept an inflated invoice or an invoice that includes substandard materials. In Step 8, the ministry reviews, approves, and passes the invoice on to the donor for payment. And in Step 9, the donor reviews the invoice and disperses funds to the foreign consultant. Here, a representative of the donor may solicit favors from the consultant to expedite payment. When we look at all 9 steps and think about the opportunities for corruption, we can see that there are possibilities everywhere. Officials at the ministry can solicit bribes from the consultants. The consultants can bribe officials in the ministry to increase their profits. And donor representatives can solicit favors from foreign contractors. This picture of the flow of donor funds is not unique to the water and sanitation sector. So we need to ask if corruption in the water and sanitation sector is any different than in other sectors. I think there are 6 reasons why corruption is especially a problem in the water and sanitation sector. The first reason is that the construction of piped water and sewer networks is so capital intensive. This means that there are big contracts and lots of money can be made by winning a big contract. The second reason is that demand for small quantities of water is price inelastic. This means that if someone can gain monopoly control over the capital assets of supply systems, it is possible to charge prices far above costs. The third reason is that water and sanitation networks are complex and hidden underground. This means that a supplier can run down the quality of the capital assets without others, for example, a regulator, having a clear understanding of what is happening. The fourth reason is that there is a lack of transparency in billing and pricing. It is not difficult for service providers to send their customers water bills that are difficult to understand and unrelated to actual water use or even unrelated to the official water tariff. Most customers cannot discern such billing discrepancies. The fifth reason is lack of market discipline. Water vendors may face market discipline, but public water utilities rarely do. Inefficiencies in production may be introduced by corrupt practices in employment and contracting. But such inefficiencies do not put much pressure on public water utilities to reform. Finally, the sixth reason is that there are many donors and NGOs working in the sector. This means that if one donor objects to a corrupt practice of a government, the government can often find the funds requested from another donor, again reducing pressure to reform corrupt practices. There's an interesting academic literature on the effects of corruption in the water sector. I'll mention a couple of papers you might like to read. In an econometric study of African water utilities, Antonio Eustache found that corruption is negatively correlated with technical efficiency in African water utilities. This means as corruption goes up, technical efficiency goes down. In another paper, Laszlo Levay and I described the water vending system that existed in Jakarta in the early 1990s. In this paper, we showed that a water supply system based on limited numbers of public taps, relatively few house connections, and water vendors can generate substantial monopoly rents. These rents can be appropriated by either public or private stakeholders, or in the case of Jakarta, by both. To wrap up, we often assume that water infrastructure will be designed to maximize public benefits, but this may not be the case. If it is designed to maximize private gains, the infrastructure may look very different by design. Thanks for listening to this video. In the next video, we will look at a detailed description of corruption in the water and sanitation sector in South Asia.